Communism, where everyone shares everything and is like living in a perfect paradise, but communism is nothing like that. In this video, I will go through the pros and cons of communism. Pro number 1, everyone can receive healthcare. Capitalist countries like the United States go for a cash-based system, that those that pay get the healthcare they need. Communist nations allow their citizens to access healthcare that is usually free, yet the wealthy first class gets a better version of healthcare, different from the lower class worker. You would think that allowing everyone to access healthcare would increase the development of a nation, removing illness and disease from the equation. Sounds like an obvious win-win scenario, as well as removing the idea of profiting off sick people and encouraging the hospitals to do their job and help people truly in need. Well, free healthcare appears great at first glance, but how the Russian USSR implemented free healthcare is a totally different story. Here is an actual account of an officer in the US Army, Ilya Kayamyshkin, and how he experienced growing up in the Soviet Union. I grew up in the USSR and became familiar with the healthcare system, both from the beneficiary point of view and from that of a provider. As my grandmother was a dentist, the government owned and ran all healthcare, and it was free to the people. However, the quality and the care in the healthcare system were dismal, long waits for specialists and advanced procedures, etc. But, as anywhere, people have developed ways to get around and get what they want. Here are some examples of the wonderful free healthcare in the USSR. Birth was to take place only at birth clinics, of which there were about half a dozen in a city of 5 million people. Husbands or any other family are not permitted to even enter, under the premise of keeping the place free of germs, etc. My delivery was very difficult for my mother. She was in labor for 3 days, and it was deemed unnecessary to give her any pain medication or do a C-section. She roamed the hallways of this hospital, howling in pain. Nobody was permitted to use the phone. There were only a few in the administration offices, so she could see my father and her parents only through a window once a day. When I was finally born, I was taken away from my mother, immediately to be placed in a post-birth unit. This was done to all newborns, and my mother did not see me until about 24 hours later. We were released from the hospital after 7 days, and that was the first time my father saw me. This is a story that was a fairly normal routine for the Soviet women, and no other option were available, as it would be then near impossible to get a birth certificate for the newborn. When my mother told this to my wife, who is American, she was horrified and had nightmares about it. When I was 2, I got severe pneumonia. I was at home with a fever of 42 degrees Celsius. This is over 170 degrees Fahrenheit. And the doctor decided that this was a lost case and would not even prescribe penicillin to try to fight the disease. It took my parents and grandparents pulling all their connections and bribing to get penicillin that fairly promptly took effect and saved me. The healthcare was provided on the basis of one's residency. Everyone was attached to a clinic close to where they lived, had a general factory practitioner that was the primary provider, who was able to refer patients to specialists, procedures, etc. So in some way, it was very similar to the HMO system in the US. On average, doctors received about half of what a skilled industrial worker received and had to put in longer hours, years of study, etc. Still, there were about the same number of doctors per 100,000 of the population as there were in the US, but there were very few specialists than here. One of the reasons there was no lack of people wanting to become doctors was the prestige and respect of the profession, and possibly a self-selection of individuals that were caring and wanted to help others. However, as shown by previous examples, such attitudes quickly disappeared once these doctors became part of the system. There was very little incentive within the official system for the doctors to provide better care for their patients, as it did not affect their pay in any way. All healthcare was free, but it was customary to bring something for the doctor, chocolates, gifts, etc. To get better, proper care, and to get referred to a better specialist required more valuable gifts. Out-of-town people could get emergency care, but were turned down for any chronic disease treatment and had to go back to their primary care provider at their place of residency and get referred locally. But the higher class specialists were in Leningrad and Moscow. They were in high demand, so there was a widespread and highly illegal private practice by special doctors and dentists. They would see patients at home and receive cash for their services. My grandmother was a dentist. and was practicing after work from her apartment. For decades, she was looking over her shoulder, afraid that she would get arrested. She had to pay her neighbors monthly not to tell on her, but the money she made was such that it was worth the risk, as it provided for a much better life for my grandparents, and allowed them to help my mother and her brother and their families. And the story was the same for thousands of other doctors and dentists. So in the end, a market, a black market, was the vessel that enabled people to get what they wanted and needed, and quite possibly save countless lives in the process. So free healthcare under communism doesn't sound that great now, does it? If free healthcare systems were so good, the people wouldn't have risked their lives on black markets for healthcare. If communist healthcare was so good, why didn't we see sick people from other countries move to the USSR to get the benefits of free healthcare? The truth about communist healthcare is that they sacrifice quality of treatment for a terrible healthcare system for everyone, which is just not worth it. Pro number 2 of communism: unemployment rates drastically decrease. If everyone in society can contribute to work, there should be a massive dip in the unemployment rate of the nation. Well, that didn't work out for the communist state of Soviet Russia. The people had access to jobs and housing, but like healthcare under communism, it takes quantity over quality. Sure, you get a house, but the house was the equivalent of a homeless shelter, sometimes without the essential commodities such as running water. The people who lived in the real apartments, which were small and overcrowded, were considered lucky. Communism promises equality, but does it in such a way that is just not worth it in the end. Pro number 3, education is easily accessible. The education system may be easier to access, but they were the equivalent of indoctrination centers for the government to control the people into mindless slaves. To prove my point, we can look at the educational indoctrination in communist China during the reign of Mao Zedong, who changed the education in China so drastically that it became a religious cult. Many of Mao's communist economic policies resulted in failure. This was quite noticeable in the Great Leap Forward of 1958, which resulted in about 20 million deaths from starvation and economic crisis. Mao took notice and was concerned for his position and his revolutionary ideology. So to combat this, educators, intellectuals, teachers, and even people in the creative fields like artists and musicians were told to obey Mao's state doctrine. At the same time, children were taught a highly politicized set of courses with the goal of making sure the children would continue their revolution of doctrine Mao believed was necessary to stop the country from turning to capitalism. China's youth were encouraged to report to authorities if teachers, parents, and other children were anyway critical of Mao or the government. In 1965, Mao started what was known as the Cultural Revolution. It was a major campaign to correct the academics. Intellectuals were attacked and accused of horrible things. They were not given a chance to defend themselves. More than a dozen presidents and many university vice presidents were criticized and fired. The whole higher education system was changed to let in students from peasant backgrounds to get into higher education to teach political propaganda in the courses. In order to achieve this, they postponed the schools from opening by 6 months. In 1966, Mao brought the indoctrinated youth from the education system to create a new national youth organization. They were mostly comprised of teenagers in college and high school. They came from the low working class. They were known as the Red Guards. They were organized, most likely due to the army's political officers. They were ordered to be the force to stop people from old ideas and customs and maintain the Maoist cult doctrine. The Red Guards struck fear into the Chinese urban population. They desecrated churches, shut down stores for selling items deemed to be too lavish, like flowers and cosmetics. The Red Guard banned Western-style hair and dress, and would cut people's hair in the streets. They raided private homes and destroyed their possessions. They even destroyed precious artworks and burned books deemed to be opposed to Maoist ideas. The Red Guards got out of hand, and China experienced economic standstill. The government ordered the military to restore order. From 1966 to 1976, the Cultural Revolution shook China to its limits. It also destroyed the possibility of career advancement for millions of people. So to put simply, communist education will turn on a dime if the state government sees any resistance to the propaganda that they spit out onto society. They will even go as far as to indoctrinate their own country's children to enforce ideas on people that disagrees with the government. Another reason why communist governments go after children is because in order for the communist government to stay in control, they need to completely indoctrinate a few generations of people. It is then the people are completely brainwashed and will not question the government whatsoever. North Korea is a prime example. The people think Kim Jong-un is a god. Free healthcare, no unemployment, and easier access to education are the so-called pros of communism. All these things at first glance sound amazing. Why wouldn't you want free healthcare? For many people that believe in communism, that is all they need to hear. But of course, on further inspection, those ideas fall apart. Now that I said the pros, which are just cons dressed up to look nice, I'll now talk about more cons of communism that are the reason the system can't be implemented. Businesses are limited. It is great that some people under communism are guaranteed the same paycheck every week, but a communist environment does not allow businesses to thrive. In a communist society, there is a limit on the business's ability to grow, while in a capitalist society, there is no such limit. A business under communist rule cannot produce as much as they want because their ability to create new products and earn more money for their extra bit of work is limited. Since every worker is paid the same, there is no incentive to grow the business. Poverty is widespread. You would think that everyone getting paid for the same amount of work would create a paradise worth living, but sadly, communism leads to corruption among the elite higher class that was elected to make sure everything was running smoothly. The elected officials became greedy, and it was greed that altered the equal profit system to be in the elite's favor. But the lower class was unable to question the government for its actions. Communism was used to make the poor poorer and the rich richer. That doesn't sound like a community sharing its wealth equally to me. Lastly is no freedom. Many of the freedoms we have now are taken for granted and are completely removed under communism. Freedom of speech is taken away. People who openly criticize the government's actions are subjected to harsh, often severe punishments. Families that are able to save up their earnings to provide for their next of kin are not allowed to offer any sort of savings or personal property once their family members are deceased. What is the point of communist equality when a human life is just a resource that can be replaced by someone else for next to nothing? Under communism, creativity is taken away. You are no longer able to create art and music the way you want. Communism's main focus is on the production and agriculture. The creative arts will be an afterthought. The only art and music that will be made is propaganda to indoctrinate the people. If you care about the environment, say goodbye to that, because communism works on trying to be as efficient as possible and could care less about the environment. The reality is that communism does not work the way it's supposed to. That is because it sacrifices many freedoms we have in capitalist countries. Communism settles for the bare minimum for everyone to share equally, yet it doesn't take into account for human nature. Whether you like it or not, we will never be able to get rid of greed. People will always want to strive for more and get what they do not have. Greed always makes any communist system impossible. People that believe communism can work are living in a dream. We must not forget that if communism was so perfect, why did 94 million people die because of it? Here is a list of deaths that resulted from communism. In the 20th century, 65 million in China, 20 million in the Soviet Union, 2 million in North Korea, 2 million in Cambodia, 1.7 million in Africa, 1.5 million in Afghanistan, 1 million in Eastern Europe, 1 million in Vietnam, 150,000 in Latin America, and 10,000 from communist movements not in power. Now I know people that believe in communism would say the reason for the high number of 94 million is a result from taking World War II into account. But the 94 million isn't taking the war into account. It is all from the hands of communism. The deaths from communism is an estimate. It could succeed over 100 million. So my question to people that believe in communism, why would you associate yourself with a system that caused over 94 million deaths? Do you think the reason it has failed every single time is the fact that it can't last for 1 second before turning into a dictatorship that enslaves its people? Maybe the reason communism doesn't work is because it's too good to be true and it lures people in for the promise of free stuff. A lot of communists have argued that communism has not been properly implemented in society. I would say yes and no to that. Yes, for that it hasn't been implemented the way it has been envisioned. But the reason it hasn't is because it just can't work. Humans cannot coexist with communism. Communism at first glance sounds like a good idea. That is probably why people still believe in it today. But as we know, they choose to ignore the problems and only look at the pros that are cons in disguise. I would want a perfect system like anyone else. It is just not worth the risk that is communism. Just for the fun of it, most believers of communism think that communism is found in nature, like in ants and bees, which all work together for the betterment of the hive. But according to a study from the University of Illinois, it doesn't seem that will be true anymore. as they found that around 25% of ants are inactive throughout their study of 3 weeks. Of course, there still needs to be more research to confirm it, but I find it hilarious that if it is found true that communism in nature, one of the biggest reasons for communism, is thrown out the window. These cafe hipsters think that communism will not affect them in any way, but under communism, you will be served bland coffee, a horrible Wi-Fi connection, with limited access to the internet. That is what you get under communism. Your hipster lives will be over, as you will have barely any time to do anything, as you'll be working every day just to keep yourself alive. If you guys want communism so bad, why not try and build a communist utopia that is isolated from the rest of society? I do think you need to test this out for yourselves on a small scale and see how impossible it really is. That is communism, the single greatest criminal ideology in history. Thanks for watching. If you like the content, like and subscribe. It really helps me out. If you have any questions for me, make sure to let me know in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.